Good afternoon and welcome to this session on Wellbeing for HR. My name is Alison Ainsworth. I'm an executive coach and the podcast host today. On behalf of 1080, this is our first part of our Wellbeing offering. Of a two-part session, we are going to focus on how do we keep HR safe in this fast-paced environment we're currently working in, and how do we support them when they are taking on the mantle of being the eyes and ears of the business? And we're going to come on and talk about that. Who's there for them? And it's no coincidence that all three of us on this call here today have extensive experience in HR. I was adding it up yesterday and felt that there was nearly 100 years, but I thought that's made us sound really old.
Oh dear.
Yeah, well, luckily we've all chosen to specialise in areas of wellbeing that enhance both our lives and also those of the clients we work with. So over to you, Karen. Do you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. So it's lovely to be here today. So as Alison said, I've got an HR background. I spent nearly 20 years working in senior leadership roles in law firms. So I had a lot of global responsibility, and most recently decided to retrain as a psychotherapist and an executive coach. And for the last year and a half, I've been running my own business, looking at therapy and coaching. And I've recently completed a qualification in autism-informed practice, which is shaping how I work with clients in an inclusive way in that space. So, yeah, lovely to be here.
Thanks, Karen. Michaela?
So, hi, everyone. I'm Michaela Henshaw. I started life as a chartered accountant. So I was in practice for 5 years and then spent the next 20 in retail at Asda and Tesco. For 11 of those, I was a senior director. So I moved from finance into HR. So I think that gives me a slightly different perspective because I can see the differences between HR and other functions. And then I went into transformation. And for the last 11 years, I've been running my own business and working as an associate for 1080, as an executive coach, career coach, facilitator, consultant, and have a specialist accreditations in resilience, health and wellbeing, hence the conversation today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, yeah, let's kick off that conversation. This was the question that we came up with, and I think Karen brought this to the table, and I particularly like the word vulnerable. So what do we mean by this? Why are HR particularly vulnerable right now? I've already mentioned the kind of fast-paced moving environment, the constant change that we're currently living in, but let's unpick that a little bit for our listeners. So, Karen, do you want to start with that one?
Ooh. Yeah, sorry, my internet just froze unhelpfully. Am I back? Yeah,
you are.
This is definitely live.
Yeah,
this is definitely live. Yeah, so I've become more interested in this topic actually since I left the profession, because I'm not sure we've ever really given a space for HR professionals to talk about the complexity of the job and what it involves. And I think people like Jo Burrell are doing some really brilliant work in this space, and her campaign is about how to make HR happy again. And I'm really passionate about how we actually might start to have conversations about this topic. So why are we seeing HR particularly vulnerable right now? I think there's lots of aspects to that, the constant change that you've already referenced, Alison. But I wonder if there's a couple more bits to that, which is maybe we've always been, but we've never talked about it. I think there's that kind of, keep calm, carry on mantra that has certainly formed a big part of my experiences. But also, voices are starting to be heard in this space. So the HR Mental Wellbeing Report in 2025, that showed that 87% of respondents felt that the support they received in their roles was insufficient. And actually 50% of people felt there was no support or they were rarely supported. And there's a quote in that too. which really resonated with me. And it's anonymous, so I can't attribute who it was. But the quote was, "You're not an employee in HR and will never be given the grace that's extended to everyone else." And when I read those words, I kind of thought, oof, actually, that kind of hits with me. And I think the other piece about the vulnerability, and maybe right now, is with AI, we're seeing perhaps more of the work that would have been more transactional for HR teams. That is increasingly being digitalized, which is brilliant, because but then the role of HR is therefore potentially evolving. And I was reading about this the other week into, you are then really into that emotional kind of carrying, and we're probably going to use this phrase, Michaela, quite a bit, the emotional container for an organization. And that recognition of that, I think, is really important, so that we can not necessarily do anything about it, but actually recognize the challenge that we're facing. So Michaela, I know you've got some thoughts too on this.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think when I moved from finance to HR, one of the first, I was always very well supported by HR in finance and as an FD. But the thing that struck me when I went into HR was, who is my HR? Where is that support? And we'll talk later about, kind of how did I do that? And, and we've all got different and similar ideas on that. But for me, I think the thing that was different about being in HR, which made it particularly vulnerable, was that you are the eyes and ears of the business, as Alison's just already used that phrase, which means, particularly at more senior levels in HR, you therefore are expected to, or in theory should be, the voice of the business, and that challenge and challenging the business around that. But you're that lone voice, you are that one person. So I think that, that the emotional container, it's not just about holding the emotional container for others when you're, dealing with lots of emotional things that are going on and you're supporting others. It's also you're holding that space and giving a voice to some of the big issues that are going on. And I think the other thing that struck me was that also in HR, there are particularly blurred boundaries between HR and line managers. It was much clearer in finance. It wasn't always, but it was much clearer. So I think, in terms of, well, what are HR there to do and what is line manager accountability? And I think HR take on a lot of the mantle that line managers really should be taking on in terms of that space, not only in BAU work, but also there's a lot of change and transformation stuff out there. And I think there's a lot, very often there's no clear RACI, there's no clear account, who's accountable, who's responsible for, that things that impact people in terms of change and transformation. And I think, and there's a lot of that out there at the moment. So I think that also makes us particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, I agree. I think you alluded to it, Karen. The business forgets that we are also employees. I know I do a lot of work in training with things like going into consultation, and I can remember thinking they always think that you know more than you do. You are the holder of all of that information, and I think actually most of the time you don't, and people forget. Well, actually, you are affected as well by this. And so, yeah, they sometimes depersonalize HR for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any other profession where, I had it countless times where you'd walk in a room and people would say, shh, HR's here. I don't know that happens with any other profession. You don't walk in the room and go, oh, BD's here. So that depersonalization, it feels real, actually, that people don't see you as a person, they see you as your role. And, I think that can kind of impact you. You kind of just get on with it, I think. But I think there is something about that depersonalization. And there's also something about, because of technology, because of how responsive we can all be now with all these wonderful devices that we have, overly reactive cultures in organizations kind of mean that everything's urgent. And, I can remember I was on a Teams call and someone was trying to get hold of me, and I'd messaged them. They called my mobile, they Teams messaged me, they called my landline, and I messaged them, so I was on a call. And then they came and stood next to me because what they wanted to talk about was the most urgent thing in that moment. And, that pressure to kind of be available, I think is driving some vulnerability in terms of well-being for HR.
Yeah.
I would definitely agree with that, Karen. And I can remember I was interviewing for a very senior director role, and one of our very senior directors rang me 19 times during that interview. And was it anything urgent? No, it wasn't. They decided it was, but it wasn't really in the scheme of things. But that pressure to deliver there and then, I think is if you think about the sort of things that people associate with HR, if it's structure change, or if it's transformation, or if it's disciplinaries, or if it's whistleblowing, it's all got to be dealt with immediately. There's so much immediacy around it. And the other thing I think about that you were just alluding to there, Karen, was when you're holding that confidential information, or you're not, because but they think you are, but you're not. The thing that really I reflected on was that I felt like I had to build trust with everybody all of the time, even if I'd got really good, strong relationships and trusted relationships, because at different points people didn't know, did I know something, did I not know something? And it was almost like, can I trust her, can I not trust her? And that, but just by virtue of the fact that you're in that role and you may or may not know some information. And I think that's really hard when you're trying to deal with that lack of trust, or I'm not quite sure because I don't know what they do or don't know.
No, it's interesting. I can remember when I was working doing site closures and things like that, you'd pull up in the car park and they think, oh, she's here, that means something's going on. So that you get your cloak out and your scythe and you'd go in, and that's how they saw you. And it's like, okay, interesting.
And building on that, we're also, I think, the complexity of legal risk and compliance pressure is also really you kind of not only trying to deal with what we've talked about so far, but you've also got, as I said, legal risk, which is only becoming more complex if we try and look at some of the legislation that's coming through. I'm very glad that I'm sitting on the outside reading about that and not thinking about how to possibly think about implementing any of it. But also the compliance risks, the FCA, the SRA, other regulatory bodies are taking more of an interest in the more people aspects of regulating businesses than perhaps they've ever done before, because of reputational risk and other things. And, all of that, you're kind of learning on the job whilst then trying to navigate and advise the business. And so when we talk about complexity, there's lots of different things that are coming into the spaces that perhaps weren't there 5-10 years ago.
No, I agree. There's a question coming from Dean here. I'm going to put that up on the screen. Around, is there a label that we are being given, or should we call it something else? Is there a better way of educating our colleagues as to what HR does? Do you think that's changing as part of this process? Because I would say it has. I mean, I think in my experience, and we are going back a few years, but I think there is an element of, should we say what we do? And this probably brings us on to the next kind of point, is who's there to support us. This is back to our HR for HR expression. Who's giving us the What do you think, ladies?
I think sorry, Karen.
No,
sorry.
You go.
I think the label is an interesting one, isn't it? And for HR, I always think, like years ago, it was like personnel, wasn't it? And then it sort of moved into HR, and now lots of people have people as their title, don't they? People director or people manager or whatever. So kind of the function's evolving, but from the outside, who kind of knows, well, what's the difference between personnel and HR and people? You know, what is this evolution? And for me, you know, coming in cold from another function, to me, the big thing was about business partnering. You know, it's not about admin. You know, do you know what to do about this disciplinary? You know, have you filled in your performance reviews and all that kind of stuff? You know, have we paid people? All of those kind of things. Yes, all of that obviously is still important, but it's about partnering with the business and having a real seat at the table for HR people, leaders. And I think it's really getting people to understand, what does that mean? It's about being much more strategic. You know, what is the people, you know, if that's the business strategy, what is the people strategy? How does the people strategy support the business strategy? And what does that mean, and what is needed in order to do that? And I'm not sure that we're always the best at describing that.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think the business partner model is certainly the one that I always worked with and did my best with my teams to try and work with. I think, agree with you, Michaela. I think it's less about the label. I think it's more about people's perceptions. And so there's something perhaps about how brave are we in our profession to say, actually, my name's Karen, my name's not HR. Because until we start to challenge some of that, there's almost this kind of, we talk about, my last team was called People and Culture. What culturally are we saying if someone walks in a room and you label them with the job that they do? So I think there's something about how much, we can call them microaggressions or whatever we want to label it. How much of that do we absorb and accept? And how much of that do we get a little bit braver in communicating, as you've said, Michaela, what it is we do, but also that we are actually human beings, and calling someone by their name, I think, is probably the minimum standard we would expect for anyone else in the organisation. So perhaps we should stand up for ourselves a bit more in that space.
Interesting.
Interesting.
I want to come on and talk about strategies, because we have said that we want to see what you have experienced in the past. So what sorts of strategies have you seen that have been helpful to support health and wellbeing in the HR community specifically? So Michaela, do you want to go first on that one?
Well, as a resilience coach, I'm going to go for my obvious one, but it's a very important one, which is, self-care, personalized resilience strategies. And that's really important because, everybody's different, and what works for me won't work for you. So really identifying what are the personalized strategies that work for you. And if you do nothing else but focus on energy, because that is the bedrock of everything we need for we can't focus on all the other nuances of resilience if we've got no energy. So one of the things that I find works really well with my clients is, and I used to do it as an HR director, was diary planning, really careful diary planning, but not just in terms of, the content of it. It was looking at it and saying, okay, so, what's in my diary that is going to give me energy? Because it's not all about things outside of work. There were some things where I got super excited about it, but there were other things in there that I knew could be quite draining. And if I had to go into a restructure meeting, that was going to be quite draining. So what was my strategy to go into that meeting so I had a high level of energy? How did I energize myself to go into that meeting? And then what was my strategy coming out of that meeting to re-energize myself before I went on to the next thing? Because the risk is you just go from meeting to meeting to piece of work to meeting, and you don't ever think about that. And then, you're not going to be at your best. You start to feel exhausted. Things start to become a bit out of perspective and overwhelming. So it sounds quite simple, but it's actually quite complex, I think. But that's where I would start, is what gives you energy, what drains you of energy, and how do you diary plan to manage that effectively?
Yeah, I think it is about being realistic about your workload planning as well. Like you say, sometimes there are some things that are genuinely urgent, and there are others that you can move around. But when do you focus on you in all of that, and what your needs are? And like you say, the energy piece, because there's nothing worse than having a very difficult meeting or conversation and then having to go on and do something and be, super energized. It doesn't work. Karen, what do you think?
Yeah, I sort of building on that. I think there's something about how I've seen it to be quite effective where teams have built reflective practice or supervision into the rhythm of work.
Yeah.
So, case reviews, lunch and learn sessions, actually, what are the key themes that are coming up from us? What are the trends? What does that mean for us? Things like, is our occupational health provider giving us what we need? So you can actually start to identify trends, but allow space for people to talk and, sharing around ER cases so that not one person is always having to deal with the complexity of those, and buddying people up to actually have someone to go and talk to about it. Because I think, if you think you're doing some of this stuff, we've already talked about the challenge of dealing with line managers who perhaps have limited capability in this space. To your point around, you do some of these meetings and then you go back to your job and you just keep bouncing through emails and things. Actually, can we create spaces where we buddy someone up with another member of the HR team? We go, actually, that meeting was really tough for me because blah, 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 blah. And we allow a space for it. So I think as individuals within teams, I think there's probably more we could do as teams to lean into some of the complexity of the work and have conversations about it, buddy people up, share the work around, and allow that space for supervision and review of cases so that we're really making sure that people aren't just absorbing and carrying on until the point they can't carry on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lovely comment there from Julie. Self-care is indeed crucial for HR. We are the glue. We talked about the emotional container there.
Yeah.
We think we are the glue. And sometimes that expectation from others, whether it's our team or the business, is quite tough. Because sometimes the glue starts to separate, and we need to be mindful of that. And Liz asked a great question here around energy. So, how can we influence, or HR influence, the culture, but also protecting their energy? I mean, gosh, there's a big question. We could be talking about.
Question. Well, do you know what I think on that is one of the key things that we can do as HR is to normalize conversations about well-being. It's very often you hear that HR don't want to be part of other, well-being conversations because, either there's that fear of looking like, they're very, either fear of vulnerability in front of other parts of the business. I shouldn't look vulnerable because I'm HR. Well, do you know what? You're human and we're all vulnerable. Otherwise, we're very odd human beings. So I think there's something about not wanting to look vulnerable in front of other parts of the business, and just thinking that we've just got to get on with it. So I think if you can normalize HR well-being conversations in HR, even if you have to start within your own team until you start to feel a bit more comfortable to then have that conversation beyond, then I think that's super important. And I know what I found when I was an HRD was that when I had some the culture I was dealing with at times was, it was very tough. And what got me through that was really knowing who my people were, who were my tribe, who were my trusted confidants that got it, that got me, and I could just go blur to. And, sometimes it might just be a rant and then I just felt much better, but they got it. Or it might be that, I had a particular challenge and I wanted to talk it through with somebody that just got it and understood me. but we all did it for each other. So we all, we all had each other's backs, and we all looked after each other, and we all supported each other. So, sort of a more personalized way, what you were talking about, Karen, in terms of the broader, sort of having all these separate, meetings, and, being able to talk about this, that, and the other. But I think it's like, just who's your friend, who's your confidant, who's that person that you can just help to get things, they help you to get things back into perspective, which I find is incredibly helpful.
And I think picking up that point about supervision, I would say that as a supervisor, wouldn't I? But I do think it is incredibly helpful that in a confidential situation you can do that. Just want to share, while you're talking, Karen, I just want to share a comment there from Jane, saying she's finding that she's resonating with a lot of this, and this whole thing about expectations, about it is our job to take on that stress. And I think what we're saying here is, I'm not sure it is entirely our job. And if we are taking it on, who's supporting us?
Yeah. And I think that's a brilliant segue to what I was going to say, actually, which is brilliant. So I think something about how accountable and responsible the profession may feel. And in reality, going back to Liz's question, when we talk about culture, accountability and responsibility don't always, because HR is about people, doesn't mean every problem to do with a person. And we know this. I'm thinking most of the audience here are going, but there's something here about how perhaps the culture of an organisation can make you feel as a professional accountable and responsible, when in fact boundaries and clear routes of escalation to say, actually, this is now more of a risk issue, or this is more of a something else issue here. Where are the points of escalation, so that from a cultural perspective, we're starting to build accountability and responsibility that sits outside of simply the people function.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah. I wonder also, sorry, I was going to say, I wonder also if it's a capability issue sometimes when they're knotty problems. Oh, that'll be an HR thing then.
That's exactly what I was just going to say, Alison, is I think, there's also something to do around educating, the rest of the business around what HR is there to do and not to do, which is equally as important, and what their responsibility as line managers is and what it isn't. So I know, we were always very clear, and to be fair, I think a lot of my, business part, who I was business partnering with, I think we had good clarity around that. So therefore we didn't always take that. But sometimes for those that, weren't quite as capable, then we did find that we were absorbing it, and then we had to kind of look at that and go, right, why is that, and how do we really educate, help to educate those people so that they build their skill and capability in being able to deal with those particular issues or manage their people in a more effective way.
No. So back to our strategies, ladies. I'm conscious of time. Is there any other suggestions that we wanted to make at this stage? One of the things I just heard you say there, Michaela, was around sort of boundaries and how many times do we have those conversations in coaching around creating boundaries about, and back to what Karen said about what's our responsibility, what's not. But I think, ensuring that we protect our own boundaries is really key.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that comes back, I think, a lot to the emotional container, in that we kind of feel like we should absorb, and therefore, does it make us look weak, or that we're not doing our job if we don't absorb all of that? And I think that comes back to the culture of the organisation, normalising, where are those boundaries, and helping the business to understand that. But HR, I think, have to be tough. I think sometimes we can be a bit soft and, just kind of go, oh, it's fine, we'll do it. And, sometimes you just have to kind of say, no, actually, no, this is what we're here to do. These are our boundaries. This is what you're there to do. And, and if it is an education issue, then, well, okay, so that needs to be part of our strategy. to educate, to make sure that we do build that capability and we do build, you know, that strategic direction and that culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Building on that, finally, I know we're out of time, but, you know, protecting your own time. We talked at the very start, Michaela, about resilience. You know, are you expected to respond instantly? Are you thinking you need to respond instantly? And actually, you do have the ability as a professional, and maybe that's something to talk about as a team, of actually how instantly do we respond, and do we need to instantly respond? Can we pause and reflect? Can we respond, not react? And I think respond, not react is a coaching tool that I use quite a lot, especially with HR people that I'm coaching, which is, are you just reacting, or do you give your space to respond? And I think if you allow yourself the space to respond, you give yourself more time to implement some of the other things that we've talked about today.
Yeah, no, brilliant. We knew we'd run out of time, ladies. We knew that. So there is a part 2, there is a follow-up, and we are hoping to explore some more of the bits of the topics we've touched on today: boundary management, self-care, resilience, etc. Who are our internal, external support sounding boards. So if there's anything anybody wants to particularly focus on, if you can either put it in the chat today or follow up with a comment on LinkedIn, we will pick it up. But the follow-up session will be on the 23rd of March at 1 o'clock. So we'll come back and give some more focus and attention to some of those issues that might help support you. But thank you very much for everybody listening. We've had some great comments, and I think we've probably resonated with a few people, maybe created a few questions for them to think about. So I look forward to encouraging you all to add some questions to LinkedIn, and we will pick them up for the next time. So thanks very much, ladies. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everybody who is listening.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.